Hello everyone, and welcome to the third session of our Creating Access Through Archival Description Workshop series. My name is Caitlin, and I am the Special Collections Consultant at the Northern New York Library Network. If this is the first video that you're starting to watch, I suggest you go back and watch videos 1 and 2 first, as this series does build on itself as we go. So we are picking up where we left off with the identity elements and defining what those are and how we populate them in along with the guidelines of DACS. So that's describing archives, a content standard. So just as a reminder of where we've been, last time we looked at the reference code and the name and the location of the repository elements, and those had a lot of information about the institution, a little bit about the collections. We also looked at the title and name of creator or creators element. So what's the who kind of is the collection about, or who aggregated it together, brought it together, as well as that title, which is kind of our entry point to know what the collection's about, kind of the first source of information a lot of researchers will skim to, is this relevant or is this not? Do I want to learn more? Do I want to click on this information tool? So today we're going to look at the other identity elements that are left. And again, let's remember that DACS talks about what level of description, what level of detail we're describing, and we're thinking about describing one chunk or a single level description, and we're looking at those required elements. So if we do nothing else, these pieces that we need. And we're also going to look at, there's an optimum. So if you have time, this is like really good information that'll help a researcher. So in today's case, we're looking at date and extent elements. So those are required. And then we're also going to look at an optimum one that is very helpful, called administrative and biographical history. And we're much like last time, we're going to look at these elements and how to populate them using examples. So the examples we're going to use are the description that's already been done by the Library of Congress. So we'll visit the Diana Denny finding aid and collection again about those caricatures and illustrations. And we're also going to visit our kind of messy, unprocessed, undescribed collection that I made up along with AI about Hollywood materials, specifically Desilu Studios, Desilu Productions. So let's dive right into it. So the first element that we are looking at today to be part of our archival description is the date field, or the date element. And let's just do a quick reminder in case we haven't looked at DACS in a little while. So I'm going to go to the website of where that guide lives, that standard lives. And if we haven't looked at this since last week or whenever the last time you watched a video was, let's just remind ourselves that it is has this table of contents to help us navigate, that it's all hyperlinked. We're working in part 1. And right now we're in chapter 2 under identity elements. And specifically right now, we're looking at the date. So I'm going to navigate there in the menu and click on date. As a quick recap, we see the chapter and the element number that we're in, its title, and that its status. So this is a required one. So we're going to look in that purpose and scope as we have before to figure out what does this element want? What should go in this field? Kind of what's its definition? So it says this element identifies and records the dates that pertain to the creation, assembly, accumulation, and or maintenance and use of the materials being described. This element describes types of dates and forms of dates. So then if we scroll down, like every element entry or record, there's a lot of information, a lot of detail. Again, use what's useful to you. Don't be overwhelmed by it. You can kind of look for the pieces that you need based on what your materials have in them and what you're trying to describe. So then sources of information, So where do we get this date information from? And it says take the information from a reliable source, including internal evidence of the materials being described. So this might come from the materials themselves, and it might come from a little research. And we'll see what that means in a few minutes. So then remember this section that's very helpful, general rules. And why is it very helpful? Is it tells us a little bit more detail about how to populate the field. But the really nice thing is it also gives us examples. So you can see, and again, I'm not going to read specifics right now because it's going to depend on what you're working on, which sections you're going to want to read. So we're not going to go through every one for the case of this introductory course. But you can see some examples if we just skim really quickly of different ways that dates are written. Including some kind of approximated dates. And all this is going to make sense in a minute. So you see there's lots of categories of dates. There's lots of types of dates. There's examples of how to write them. There's descriptions of what all these types of dates, as they refer to them, mean. But again, for our purposes, I am going to simplify it because we just want to get started with description. So the big kind of question that this field is answering is what time period do the materials cover? So again, we're talking about the collection materials themselves here. And then there's those two categories that it brought up, that we have types of dates and we have forms of dates. So what types of dates are there? So we're going to kind of talk about three main categories of dates today. We have what's called date ranges. So as it sounds like, this is a range of dates from one to another. And there's subcategories within that. So we have something called inclusive dates, and that's going to be much like it sounds. So inclusive, it means it includes. So it's going to be all of the dates that are represented in the collection. So this will be from the earliest date that you can identify or you can find in the collection, the very earliest thing that you have, all the way to the very latest date that you have. And so then that's going to encompass everything that's in between those two dates. So by looking at that, we'll know that we have every single time period that exists in the collection materials as far as we can identify. Then there's another type of date range called predominant or bulk dates. And what that means is the real question is like, what time period do the majority of the materials fall in? So for example, let's say we have a collection of letters that has 3 boxes that are from the 1860s. And then as we look through the letters, we find that they all are in the 1860s, except there's maybe 2 or 3 letters that are from the early 1900s. So what's important to researchers in this example is the main run of letters, the majority of the letters. A researcher who's studying the time period of the 1860s really cares about those, and that's what they're going to show up to want to use this collection for. So in this case, we would say that we would ignore kind of those outliers from the early 1900s because there's so few of them, and we are going to say that we have a bulk date, so the majority of the material is from the 1860s. And then we also have a category that we can use that's called estimated date ranges. So estimated or approximated, like it says, is you may not know exactly which years or dates the materials are from, but you may have enough contextual clues, to make an educated guess. So perhaps you have photographs and you can tell by who's in them, what model and style cars are in them, what people are wearing. You might have letters where there's certain types of ink present or they're handwritten versus typed. And just based on technology and different types of clues and information about the collection, the creators, you might have enough clues where you can kind of guess when this happened. So you'll see if we go back to DACS, I'm going to scroll down. For these kind of estimated dates, you can see that they put a lot of words ahead of them. This clues in the researcher that it is a guess. It is, educated guess, but it's still a guess. So we have words like approximately and then a year range, or circa and then a year range. So we are being transparent about what information we know and what information we're kind of taking that educated guess about based on context clues. Okay, so that's one category of materials if we have ranges going from a year to another year or a date to another date. We also could just have a single date. We could have a collection that's just about one point of time, one period of time, 1 year, 1 day, something like that. So this is a little bit simpler, the subcategories that exist. So we have things that are exact single dates. So we know we know for a fact from the materials or whatever information we have, we know this is definitely March 3rd, 1972. We know that for sure. And then much like the date ranges, maybe you have enough clues where you kind of know when it is, but you don't have enough evidence to be 100% confident. So we also have estimated single dates where you have words that are like approximately, circa, before this date. So you have enough clues to give people some useful information to decide if it's something that applies to their research or applies to their interests. You give them a little bit of information, but you're transparent about letting them know that like we used some clues to guess this, to kind of educatedly guess this date, but we're not positive when it is. And then you could have a situation where you just have no idea what time period it's from. You have no dates, which in that case, you won't have information to fill in this field. So much like other information that we've talked about so far, we kind of want to standardize our data entry as much as possible for dates because, again, it makes things easier for us to maintain and edit when we know what to expect and how to format in the computer. It helps us revise those things and maybe make bulk changes or bulk revisions later when we know exactly how our data is structured. And it's also going to help the computers interpret it and use it in a better way when we can kind of tell it what to anticipate. So it just helps us manipulate and maintain our data in a much better way. Also helps it make it easier for researchers to read because you kind of see things in the same format every time. You know where to expect information, what order it's going to come at you at. So for dates, we're just going to kind of briefly talk about what some options could be. Again, consistency is the most important thing. So how you format your date may depend on what kind of a system you're putting it into. Like your cataloging system may want it in a certain format. So here's just some examples. So for a range, we could have a 4-digit year and then a dash, another 4-digit year, such as 1999 to 2004. We could also have a single. So then the next two examples are single dates. So you could just have a year. Again, this time for this example, we're using 4 digits. We could also have a single date that includes a month, a day, and a year. So in this format decision, this structure, I took an example that I saw in DACS. So the way they wrote it was a 4-digit year. So example 1972, a month that they abbreviated to 3 characters. So MAR for March, and then the day and numbers. So 15 for the 15th. Some programs I've seen also will like it where instead of kind of having that alphanumeric combination, they only want numbers. So maybe in that case, you might have something like 1972 dash, and then your month will also become a number. So 03 for March, and then another dash, and then 15. So again, you're really going to want to understand whatever system you're putting it into, how you should format that again, consistency is your best friend in archives. So how to do that in a way so that the data could be best used based on what the computer system can want, assuming you're using a computer system. So let's look at what a date could look like in a description that already exists. So we're going to go visit Diana in the finding aid put out by Library of Congress. So let's just see what we can learn, so from like a research user perspective, about the date of this collection and how fast we can learn that information. Because again, our goal is to communicate this information quickly and concisely so a person can figure out how useful it is. If they have to sift through a whole bunch of information, it's not gonna be as likely to be useful. Okay, so I'm scrolling down. So we're to this collection summary again, where we've spent a lot of time looking at information. And we can see, second line down, they must be using some guidance, so that's DACS or DACS adjacent. we can see that they tell us exactly what they're doing for dates. So they tell us they are inclusive dates, which, if you remember back to our slide, inclusive means it includes everything. So what that now tells us is that 1945 is the earliest date that exists in this collection of materials. The earliest materials that exist are from 1945, and it goes all the way through 1961. So the most recent thing in the collection that exists was created in 1961. So if we go back to our slides, we can see wherever I'm keeping track, because remember, we want to keep track of all this data that we are creating for our description, all those Lego blocks that we're making for these elements, so that we can plug and reuse them other places. So it might be a Word doc, a spreadsheet, however you're doing it. So I would want to keep track that this is for the date element. So that's chapter 2, part 4. You may want to keep track of that too, just to know where it maps. And then we are going to know that these are in the type of date is it's inclusive. And here are the actual dates, 1945 to 1961. So these are all things that I'm going to want to note to be able to use this description in the future. Okay, so now let's look at our second example. So our kind of like messier example from our Hollywood topic to figure out what date type and what date form we can get out of this collection. So I'm not going to read you this whole thing again because we talked about it last time, but I do want to just remind you what we're talking about. So we have this collection. We are at the Museum of Entertainment History. We got this new collection, and we know that it is about a television production studio called Desilu Productions, or Desilu Studios as it's sometimes called. And they had some hit shows called I Love Lucy, The Untouchables, Mission Impossible, Star Trek, and a few, things like that. And what kinds of materials did we get? We got scripts, we got production notes, we got a lot of things that have to do with the operation of this television studio, including business records, personnel files, kind of memorabilia like action figures. We have awards, costume and set design sketches. We also have letters and correspondence between the two owners, as well as with guest celebrities. So that's kind of what we're working with. So if we look at this a little bit closer, what can we find for date information that's just given to us without us having to do any more work? And what we see is we know that we have records when the studio was founded in 1950. So those records are in these boxes. We also have records from when it was sold, some kind of records from when it was sold to Gulf and Western in 1967. All right, so that's important to know. So if we keep skimming through the paragraphs, we know what some TV shows are. We don't know when they happened, just from reading this, if we have no other background knowledge of the collection. We also have some awards, but we don't have specific information about what year they were issued. We know there's letters. We don't know exactly what years those happen. But we can see that the sale of there was one more date given to us, in that Lucille Ball bought Desi Arnaz, so her co-owner's holdings in 1962, and that's when she became the sole owner. So by only looking at this information, what do we know? We know that the earliest date that we could find that exists in the collection was its founding of the studios in 1950. We also know that the latest date that we could find, and what we know so far, is its sale in 1967. We also found an additional date of when Lucille Ball assumed full ownership in 1962. So we just kind of gathered all that information. So now we have to figure out what we can do with that. So what kind of date can we create based on what we know? So we have we have dates. So if we start at the bottom, we have dates, so no date is not a problem. We have more than one date. So a single date is not something that's useful to us, which narrows down to working in a date range. Now, let's start at the bottom of that list. We actually have dates that came off materials. So we don't need to estimate dates. We know exactly what they are. We have confirmation of what they are. So that's out. Predominant or bulk dates, again, that's like if the majority of the materials are kind of around one range of dates and there's some outliers. But we don't know enough about our materials to even know if there's outliers. So that's out. So that leaves us to know that since we have the earliest date that ever exists and the latest date that ever exists, we are going to use inclusive dates. So it's going to include everything that happened in between. So the whole run of this company's existence. So again, wherever I'm jotting down my information, I'm going to write down that it is an inclusive date and it's from 1950 to 1967. Now, as a quick little aside, if we really wanted to know more information, if we were processing this collection, organizing it, arranging it, learning more about it, we could do research to be even more specific with our dates or have even more detail. Remember, description is something you can kind of like keep revisiting and keep revising. So we could go and do some more research. So maybe we pull the names of the TV shows and figure out when they were produced so we know those dates. So, I Love Lucy ran from 1950 to 1959. So now we know we have those kinds of materials. Maybe we go and we actually like look in our boxes, which it's a fake collection, so I don't have boxes to look in. But maybe we look in our boxes and we figure out like what years are on the award plates. And we kind of can see where the majority of the dates lie. Are they kind of clustered together? Is it spread out over the whole thing? So you could maybe become a little more specific in the information you could include about dates with some more digging and some more research. But we want to keep it simple. We just want to get some kind of a basic description done. So we're just going to run with this. Okay, the next element that we're working on today is something called extent. So let's quickly just go and remember how to use DACS again. So I'm going to go into this side menu. We're in Chapter 2, Identity Elements. You can see right here. Your screen may look a little different just depending on how big you have your window. The menu might shuffle, but it should all look the same. And then 2.5, extent. So we're going to follow that hyperlink when we click on it. And again, tells us it's a required element. Okay, so what is the purpose of this? So this element indicates the extent, which using the word in the definition is a little confusing, but hang with me, we'll get there. In the physical nature of the materials being described. This is handled in two parts, a number or a quantity, and an expression of the extent of the material. Okay. So, and then, as always, they give us a lot more information. Again, use as much or as little as is useful to you and what you're trying to accomplish. In this case, you see there's kind of a new thing called an exclusion, which we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about, but I just want to point out, what does that mean? They might actually tell you what information shouldn't be put into an element because it lives somewhere else. So in this case, they're telling us anything about the physical characteristics. There's another element that you may want to use. And again, I'm not going to go into this. We're not going to worry about this right now, but just so you know, there's another kind of a category that could exist in an element, record, or entry that could be useful depending on how much detail you're going into. Then you can see, once again, the general rules, giving you some more information about what goes in the field with examples. So we're going to come back to this, but first let's go to my simplified version. So the real question of extent is, how much stuff do you have? How much stuff is there? And again, that's going to be broken into two parts, and the math person in me likes to turn this into another little simple equation. So we can say extent, or the how much stuff we have, how we're going to describe that, how we're going to write that down and tell someone else, is going to be made of two parts. So first we're going to have a number, or as they said, a quantity, a count of the stuff. So we have 2 somethings. We have 5 somethings. But then the question is, what is the something? So that's why the unit is really important. So the unit is going to tell us what the something is. What are we describing? Because it's very different if we're describing 2 bowling balls, 2 boxes, 2 pallets, 2 pieces of paper. So those are very different things. And a researcher really wants to know how much stuff there is, because if they're interested in using it, they're going to want to know how much stuff do they potentially have to look through, how much time is it going to take them, how useful is it going to be. If they're traveling very far, is it going to be worth their trip? Because chances are you're not going to want to travel hundreds of miles to look at a piece of paper. Maybe. It depends on how important it is. So that's why extent is important to share with researchers. And of course, you also want to know how much stuff you have, so you know how much shelf space you have. When you're looking for the materials, do you have all the boxes that you're supposed to have? So for inventorying purposes and care. So again, this helps both for care and maintenance, and it also helps with discovery and for researchers to make decisions. Okay, so what can those units be? So first we have something called material type. So again, that's kind of like what just is the material itself. So do you have 500 photographs? Do you have 3 scrapbooks? So photograph, scrapbook. So that's the format that the material exists in. That can be a unit. You also can have something that's kind of a little bit bigger, a little bit broader. So more of what I'm calling the container type. So what do those materials live in? So for example, a box. So we might have 1 box. You can also be more specific about the type of box. Because again, we're trying to give researchers and we're trying to give ourselves an idea of what are we looking for? How much stuff is there? What can I expect to look at? So you could say it's 1 document box. And it's for some people who do a lot of archives work, you can kind of picture how big a document box is in your head. You can also, you'll see, I think it's in here. Whoops, sorry. Sometimes, I thought there was an example. Anyway, some people even may list the dimensions of the box next to the box, so it gives you an idea of kind of how big it is. And again, there's tons of examples in that DACS guide. You kind of just saw me scroll through, so you can get ideas of what you might want to write if you don't even know what to write in the first place, or what units could exist. And finally, there's something that I'm calling archival measurements. So these are just kind of a different type of unit, a different way to measure things. And it's usually done because it helps archives and institutions with special collections know how much shelf space is being taken up by materials. So there's 2 kinds of units or measurements. One's called cubic feet and one is called linear feet. So again, just a type of measurement that we can do to figure out how much stuff there is, how much space it takes up. So if we go to the Diana Denny finding aid again, let's find out how much stuff is in this collection. Especially, maybe we want to look at it. Is it worth a trip to DC to go look at her work? So if we come to this collection summary, we're coming down the side, we see title that we already saw, we see dates that we already saw as an element that we went over, we see creator, and here we get to extent. So we can see by looking at this that there are 397 drawings, or 397 is our number, our count, and what is our unit? It is drawings, newspaper clippings, and graphic display material. So if we think about what we just talked about, they're telling us the material format or the material type as their unit. So that tells us if we went down there are 397 things, either drawings, newspaper clippings, or graphic materials that we would potentially get to look through if we wanted to study this collection that Diana Denny created. So again, we can kind of see that broken down. One color-coded so you can see the numbers versus the unit, and one that just kind of captures the information that we would want to jot down to know what our kind of answer is for this element of archives description, so we can use that Lego block or that element in whatever purposes we want to use it for. So now if we go to our Hollywood collection, let's figure out how much stuff is here. How much stuff came to us in this collection? We're just going to assume we're keeping it all for now. So luckily enough, it's broken down, so it's very clear that we have a number of boxes, and each paragraph kind of describes that. So if we look in total, there are 5 boxes of materials that came as part of this collection. So what do we know? Well, not a lot. There's not a lot of detail given to us at this time. We know we have 5 boxes. If we knew even more, you can also see in this second paragraph, we do know we have 15 reels of film. If we decided to if those were super important and we wanted to point it out, we could point that out. For now, we're just going to keep it simple. There's 5 boxes of stuff. So 5 is our number and boxes is our unit. Now let's make this a little bit more interesting, just for the sake of practice. So let's assume that we know that the boxes are record storage cartons. So that's a type of box. So if we assume the size of the box, then what can we know? So I'm going to go to this website. And this is just one example of, it's called the Rebel Archives Calculator for Cubic and Linear Feet. So to make it more interesting, I'm going to pretend that I want to know how much shelf space it takes up in these other types of archival or library measurement units. I'm sure it's used other places too. So this is just one example of a type of calculator, and this one's made by the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, to figure out what the calculation of space would be to convert it. So as you can see, when we look at it, there's kind of different columns of information. So we have types of containers, and they have some pre-populated for us that are kind of commonly used storage containers, especially for archival collections. We can have the numbers of containers, and you can see that's a field we can actually fill in. And then you can see it has a column for cubic feet, so that's one of those types of measurements, and then one for linear feet, so that's another type of measurement. So in our case, we said, let's pretend we know that these boxes are record storage cartons, which luckily enough is the first, handily enough, it's the first row. And then if we really wanted to know, we can also see what other information we have is we know exactly how big this box should be if it matches their description. So we can see up here at the top, it tells us that the types of containers are measured by length in inches, width in inches, and height in inches. So for our record storage carton, our size of our box would be 16.25 inches by 13 inches wide by 10.5 inches tall. So though we're going to say those are the sizes of boxes we have, I'm going to type in that I have 5 of them. And then you can see it automatically does the math for us and spits out that we have 6.42 cubic feet of material, or if we'd rather have it in linear feet, we have 5.42 linear feet of material. And again, this is just a way to kind of, if you need different kind of units or measurements of your material to figure out how much shelf space it takes up, something like that, it's a way to convert your measurements into something else. And as I mentioned, there's all kinds of kind of standardized archival boxes, so letter document boxes, legal document boxes, oversized boxes in here, so it's very easy and handy to use. They also have tubes, rolls. The thing I want to point out before we move on, though, is this is one of my favorite things at the bottom, is they leave your room for a custom container. And why is that handy? If you have your materials are in something that's not one of those standardized archival boxes, so maybe I just got a collection in, we haven't put it in new materials yet, but I want to know how much stuff there is. Maybe just to be able to put it on a shelf space, to make a basic description for an accession record. Maybe I'm writing a grant and I'm trying to figure out how much stuff I have and how many other kinds of boxes I want to buy, or doing some kind of a supply order. So you can come in here and you can measure the length, the width, and the height of your box in inches. You can type them in this most left column, and then you can type in how many of those you have, and as with the top example, it will spit out exactly how much cubic feet or linear feet you have. As you can see at the bottom here, if you have boxes you have multiple boxes, maybe one collection has things stored in multiple ways, at the bottom it'll actually give you a total. So right now it has my five record carton boxes, and what they add up to. But if I add, say, one oversized flat folder, you'll see it goes up to now I have 6 containers, and that those total numbers changed a little bit. So you can even have mixed sized containers, but still add up the total number of things you have. So anyway, just a handy tool. And again, there's other people have made other ones that are out there. This is just the one I've used most recently. Okay, so what did we learn from doing that? We learned that we have 5 boxes. If they're record carton boxes, here's kind of like conversions of other size options, depending on how we want to document them, put them in our systems, what units our systems want, that we can write down. Okay, and last but not least, here is our last element of the day, administrative and biographical history. And so what is this? And again, if we go to DACS, go down to 2.7 and click on that, we get our record that tells us all about it. But to keep things simple today, it's going to describe the creators, describe the relationship of the creators to the archival materials by providing information about the context. And context here is a really, really important word. So who or what is this collection about? So we are not talking about the materials themselves here. We're really talking about the context of how they came to exist, how they came to be together, what people were involved to lead to them being created in the first place. So it could include information about the names of the creators, the dates they lived, the professions they held, where they were located. Again, really wanting to understand the activities and the relationships of things that made these records come to exist in the first place. So where can you get this kind of information? So it can come from you can ask the donor of the collection if they know anything about who made it, how it came to be aggregated together, collected together. Any kind of community members or stakeholders, so maybe people who are family members or neighbors, employees of a company. You can look at obituaries. A lot of times those are great sources of information, especially for individual people, to kind of give context to their life and how they ended up being involved in whatever your materials are. There's also published materials. You can do, this is something that can kind of be time intensive depending on how you decide to tackle it. So you can do a bunch of research, publish sources, such as books and websites, press releases, all kinds of things you can dig into. But some of the most helpful things to either give you clues or give you information are the materials themselves. So if we look at our example of Diana Denny, we're going to scroll down in her finding aid to see what they gave us for administrative or biographical history about this collection. So what did they decide to write about? What does this really mean? So here we see they are calling it a biographical note. And what information is in here? And I'm just going to try to summarize best I can. You're welcome to read it if you would like to. But we know so this is because Diana Denny, one person, created this collection. This is really about her and how she came to be involved as an artist in caricatures, which are now in this collection. But how did she even come to become an artist in the first place? What is the context that surrounded her doing this work? So we found out when and where she was born, her education, so she got a BFA and an MFA at the University of Pennsylvania, scholarships she won and training that she did in both France and Spain, and that this training in portraiture led her to draw political caricatures, which is a lot of what this collection is. So kind of like, where did she get her foundation to end up getting to do this work someday? And how her career took off, working for newspapers, becoming a caricature artist for those newspapers. And then you can see that she had a big part of her career doing this was in the 40s and 50s for a series of newspapers. And, kind of what is the significance of her? Like, why her and not another caricature artist? We can see that here they point out at a time when women in her profession were rare. So like, again, really giving us that context of like, why does this matter? What's important? What led to this being existing? And then we can see what she did when she kind of wasn't doing that kind of newspaper work as much. What she go on to do after. So she worked at a printmaking studio and remained active in areas of this throughout her life. And then it ends with her passing and where she lived at that time. So again, really giving us that context, that background. Oops. So again, if we wanted to even dig up even more information, we could go to her obituary. For time's sake, I'm not going to look at that today. So how do we figure out what's important from our Desilu example? So again, we're going to kind of study the information we have in the materials themselves, just to keep it simple. So we know when the studio was founded, when it was sold, that they were in television, that they had some really big hit shows, that they won awards for and all kinds of things. We know who owned it and that it was co-owned and then eventually sole-owned by the first woman to ever own and operate a major television studio. So we have some basic information. So based on that basic information, I put together this little example biographical history. So Desilu Productions was founded by husband and wife team Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz in 1950. The studio was particularly known for its iconic television series, including I Love Lucy, The Untouchables, Mission Impossible, and Star Trek. In addition to starring in several of the shows and being renowned as the Queen of Comedy, so here's where I did a little research to give the significance of the collection, why this studio, why these founders. Ball became the first woman to own a major television studio when she bought Arnaz's holdings in 1962. Desilu was sold to Gulf and Western in 1967. So this is a perfectly acceptable biographical history. It also could be shorter. It could be one sentence. So if we look at this DACS example, I'm going to just scroll down. You can see there's kind of an array. Some are timelines, some are paragraphs. So you can see a lot of examples there of chronologies and timelines, things like that, of what this could look like. And again, we can kind of deep dive or not deep dive into how much research we do to kind of beef this up or not. To start, we just want to keep it simple. Our goal is just to get information out to people to know this exists and why they might care about it, why it matters, why it's been preserved. So this is perfectly acceptable for us. So that brings us to the end of this video, finishing up identity elements. So for those of you who are registered for the class, this week we are going to look at some examples of description that already exist, really focusing on the elements we talked about today. And then we'll also look at some unstructured data to practice how to create those identity elements. And for everyone, I'll see you in the next video.